I was like, which election? I was like, how long has Trump been on the scene? I was like, I've blocked a lot of it out.
Too long.
So agree. So agree. Hello, team, and welcome to Beerocracy. I'm your host, Emily Gross. Very excited today because I have Kevin Hamilton with me from Perkins Coie, who's a wonderful lawyer who, he did not tell me to say this is just off the top of my own head, looks like a Kennedy, super young, probably the most athletic person I've ever seen. The best lawyer. Honestly, well, that's probably true. The best lawyer. But 20-something years old, Kennedy-looking lawyer. How are you, Kevin?
Thank you. None of that's true, but I appreciate it anyway.
So we are here to talk about all the election court cases that are taking place even before, it's even November 5th. For those who are listening, I'm wearing my vote shirt. If you scan the QR code, it brings you to vote.org. And it feels like a really good shirt to be wearing while we talk about this. But Kevin, please introduce yourself. And then also, can you explain why you're not going to be drinking a beer today?
Sure. So I'm a partner at Perkins Coie. I've been doing political and election law for over 30 years. I'm actually drinking coffee right now. Of course, it's a latte because I'm in Seattle. Mostly because, as I explained earlier, I was spent the morning at the Washington State Supreme Court arguing, and I had a beer this afternoon. I think I would just probably fall asleep on that couch right there, and I wouldn't be here. So
yeah. That's a very good reason. So I'm going to drink the beer for the both of us. Drinking Upward Brewing Co. It's called Hex because, once again, it's been my theme is that it feels like the election system is hexed. All right. So cheers.
Cheers.
I read that there's been around 130 court cases by the RNC that are targeting voter rolls, that are targeting voting rights, that are targeting the access to vote, and it's not even November 5th. Can you explain a little bit what it's been going on? And then you were just arguing in front of the Washington Supreme Court, what that case has been, and then some of the rulings that have come out recently.
Okay, big question. So yes, there've been a lot. I'm gonna back up. If we go back 4 years ago, there was a lot of litigation before the 2020 election. Of course, as you will remember, that was the middle of COVID. And so a lot of the lawsuits we filed on behalf of the Democrats, trying to ease voting rules in light of COVID, making mail ballots available, establishing drop boxes, establishing longer periods of time for ballots to arrive because of mail delays, all of that sort of stuff. The Republicans they were much more on the defensive, opposing most of our litigation until after the election, 2020, between Election Day 2020 and January 6th, there were something like 63 lawsuits filed trying to challenge and overturn the election. They lost all those cases, with one exception, some random state court case in Pennsylvania that didn't really matter. But otherwise, they lost them all. They seem to have taken that to heart, that lesson. And there's been a huge outpouring of conservative dark money, meaning not reported, that has just flowed into the system. And this time they are much more on the aggressive. So you're right. I can't confirm that number because I don't know. But it's a lot. That number doesn't surprise me at all. It's been a lot of lawsuits, big lawsuits, little lawsuits going on all over the country, trying to tighten and make it more difficult for people to vote, all on the theory that there's somehow a danger of voter fraud out there. And so we have to be careful. We have to restrict demand ID in Arizona. It's a demand for proof of citizenship before you can cast a ballot. I'm not sure where your proof of citizenship document is. I'm not sure where I found mine.
I have no idea. I don't know.
Presumably my passport would work, but I don't know. So it's that kind of lawsuit. We can put them into kind of buckets. Like one big bucket is voter registration list lawsuits. So every day in America, somebody dies, somebody is convicted of a felony, somebody's released from prison and is restored to their civil rights. Somebody moves between one state or another, or maybe moves within a state. Every time something like that happens, the voter rolls have to change. And then that's assuming that the voter thinks to even notify the state or the county that they've actually moved. They're dead. They're not the ones
Yeah,
who
they
even
can't
notify.
let them know.
But the county knows because of the death certificate, then, and should be communicating. And so the election officials have this ongoing job of keeping that up to date. But of course, if you took a snapshot at any one time, you're going to find people that are dead or convicted of felony just because the system hasn't quite caught up with it. That doesn't mean anybody's committing fraud. That doesn't mean anybody's voting those ballots, but it does mean the lists may be a little bit over inclusive, and that's fine. Or at least it's been fine up until now. The lawsuits sort of point out some of these little errors on the list and claim that means the state isn't doing its job in keeping the registration list current. Those kinds of lawsuits have been filed in Mississippi, in Nevada, in North Carolina, and just literally across the country. So that's one bucket, and then the other bucket is a kind of clever argument, or overly clever in my view, that federal law establishes election day. Right? It's the first Tuesday after the first Monday every November for federal offices. That's election day. And all the states have to have the election for federal offices on the same day. You can't say, well, that's fine for you all, but we're going to do it on, November 6th, on Wednesday, not November 5th, Friday. Federal law doesn't allow them to do that. And the argument is, if you vote your absentee ballot and it's received by the election officials after election day, that's allowing people to vote inconsistently with federal law. That is, you're allowing them to vote. They're saying the vote occurs. You cast your ballot when it's received by the by the election official, not when you mail it. And there's something like 18 states, including Washington State, where as long as you mail it by election day, it can be received several days later. In other words, you cast your ballot when you put it in the mailbox, and you can't retrieve it anymore.
Yeah, and we all know the post office is not really known for its timeliness recently.
Right.
So
Right. And that's the other problem with that theory is, you can put your ballot in the mailbox 3 days before election, thinking no problem, it'll get there. But because it's something that you have no control over, it gets there late. So their theory is it's a conflict with federal law, and any ballots received after election day can't be counted. They sued Mississippi and they sued Nevada over those rules because both states allow ballots to be received after election day. They lost both lawsuits, and they appealed both of them. In Nevada, it goes to the Ninth Circuit, a relatively liberal court. In Mississippi, it goes to the Fifth Circuit, relatively conservative court. And they moved to expedite the lawsuit in the Fifth Circuit, and they moved to slow down the lawsuit in the Ninth Circuit. Wonder why they did that. I wonder why. And that case was argued about 2 weeks ago in front of a very conservative panel of a very conservative court. And last week, that panel issued a decision reversing the court in Mississippi and agreeing with the Republicans that ballots can't be counted if they're received after election day. Now, the court said it's too close to this. It's probably too close to this election to apply that rule to this election, but we're going to let the district court figure that out. And so they remanded it to the district court.
Correct me if I'm wrong. Isn't the Fifth Circuit the same one that overturned that brought the mifepristone abortion pill case through?
I think that's right. I think so.
Actually. And I think they did the same thing too, where they're like, So we're going to say no, but we don't really want to deal with it. So we're going to send it back down to the lower courts and take all this
Right.
time for you guys to figure it out.
Well, and it has a interesting implication because they didn't issue an injunction. There's nothing to appeal to the Supreme Court. So the state of Mississippi can't take it up to the Supreme Court because they didn't. They just said, well, maybe not, but it's up to you, trial court, to decide. Yeah. So anyway, so there's lots of. I mean, those are two big categories, but there's lots of other lawsuits. They're literally coming in every day. They're kind of stacking up like cordwood at this point.
Oh my gosh. And the Supreme Court is considering a few and just ruled on a couple, if I believe.
That's right. In the Pennsylvania case, I think they remanded it. I haven't, honestly, as I said, I was preparing for this Washington Supreme Court argument, so I haven't really been tracking what's happened in the last 36 hours, which is a huge amount of time in the election law world. Right before the election, there's
literally, oh my god, it's like 20 years. It's like light years versus real years. You're like, what does this mean?
That is exactly right. Things are going crazy.
But there was these two cases, North Carolina and Pennsylvania. North Carolina, I believe, Supreme Court allowed 1,600 voters to technically be purged from the voter rolls.
It was Virginia. I think that was Virginia.
Was it Virginia? Might have been Virginia. Virginia. North Carolina comes in some. See, there's so many.
Yeah, North Carolina, I think, was the UOCAVA, the overseas and military voters.
Oh, that was what I was reading. Yeah. It all blends together.
It does. It's hard. It's really hard to keep them straight. And the Virginia case was interesting because, I mentioned that states have this obligation to clean up their voter rolls, and it's kind of an ongoing obligation. But the federal law says in the 90-day period before an election, we call that a quiet period, where states cannot engage in systematic voter roll purging because you're just too close to the election. If you purge somebody from the voter rolls, mistakenly, the voter gets notice and the voter has a chance to come back and fix it. But if you're in the 90-day window, the voter may not get notice of that, and the voter may actually show up at the polling place and be completely unaware that they're not on the roll anymore because the state purged them. So the theory of the federal law is you can't do this in the 90-day period. So Virginia, this is Governor Youngkin, I think that Youngkin was going through and purging so-called non-citizens from the voter rolls, and he determines who's a non-citizen because in the form when you have to check a box, it confirms I'm a citizen on your request for an absentee ballot, and if you don't check that box, they assume not that you forgot or you missed the box, but that you're affirmatively saying you're a non-citizen. Those are the people they're rejecting. Obviously, there's a lot of noise, there's a lot of error in taking that approach. And so that's what that litigation was about. And so the Democrats are taking the position, well, you can't do this. You're in the quiet period. You're not allowed to do this. And the Supreme Court, in an order, I think yesterday or the day before, said, yes, you can. And so there's something like 1,600 voters that are being purged like that.
That's good. That's good. I'm glad everyone federal follows the law. That's fine.
Hopefully they're paying attention to that. Hopefully that they're being, it's a small enough group. I mean, 1,600 votes is more than enough to swing the outcome of a close election. But hopefully it's a small enough group that that the state party can reach out to them and make sure that, if they're indeed American citizens, that they're allowed to vote. You wouldn't think that would be a controversial thing, but it is.
Everything's controversial nowadays, especially when it comes to voting. Unfortunately, Pennsylvania was also really interesting.
The lawsuit. I'm going to speak generally about their overseas lawsuits because they're definitely doing that in North Carolina. I think that's right about Pennsylvania, but I'm not as familiar with that case. The allegation is, so there's a statute called UOCAVA, means overseas and uniform something, people living abroad. And it covers both military ballots, but it also covers people who live overseas. And so in the North Carolina UOCAVA lawsuit, they're pointing out that instances of North Carolina residents, people who live there and move overseas. So they move for a teaching job in Berlin or in Paris or London or someplace, and they end up staying there. They're still American citizens. They still have the right to vote, and they had residency in North Carolina, so they still have residency there, and that's where they get their ballot, and that's where they vote. North Carolina law, to its credit, says, and if those people have kids in Berlin or Paris or London, when those kids grow up and turn 18, they inherit that citizenship from their parents. Of course, they're American citizens from the beginning of their birth because their parents were Americans. But they also inherit the residency, the North Carolinian residency of their parents for the purposes of voting. And the lawsuit says, well, hold on. The North Carolina state constitution requires that you live in North Carolina for at least a year to establish residency in order to vote. And these people, these kids, they never lived in the United States at all, let alone in North Carolina. So their argument is, the North Carolina legislature can say whatever it wants to say, but it cannot contradict the North Carolina Constitution. So that's the argument there. And I think that they brought that, or a variation of that lawsuit, in other states. It's kind of interesting. I like the thing about that one that really made, and I don't know the answer to this, is how many of those people are there? I mean, I know that there's, folks that live abroad, American citizens that live abroad. My sister lives in Switzerland. She's lived there for a long time. And then their kids are American citizens. And I'm sure that there's a few thousand of those, but it seems like we're getting to a pretty small population.
I think that is the general vibe, and especially what's been spoken frequently from the Republican Party, which is the big talk of all the people, but there's really not a lot of people. Right. For my day job, I had to do some research on voter fraud today. And the AP did an analysis post the 2020 election. And of 6 swing states, they found 475 instances of potential voter fraud out of the 25 million votes that were cast in those 6 swing states. So that's just, I feel like, good context for people to have.
Well, it almost, and that's almost certainly suspected voter fraud. If you narrow it down and ask, okay, how many of those instances were actually proven? Like if it's really easy to say voter fraud because, say, for example, the signatures didn't match. But, a lot of times when you dig into that, you realize what happened is it's a married couple and they signed each other's ballots. Okay.
I know there was one instance of like a woman who had a stroke and she forgot that she voted already, So it's like the malicious intent for majority of those 475 are not even there. I mean, I find it very interesting that the GOP is on this extreme offense, very, very close to Election Day. How long has this been going on? And you mentioned that technically 90 days beforehand, voter rolls are not supposed to be touched. How long has this been going on? Because I feel like now it's just starting to get a lot of the media coverage.
It's really been over the course of the last year. It's been kind of a slow ramp up. Just like, I think if you plotted it on a chart, it would kind of steeply rise off to the right as Election Day approaches and these lawsuits are getting filed. There's sort of a trade-off. You don't just file a lawsuit and get relief just like that. In fact, the closer you get to Election Day, the more difficult it is to win an order changing something significant, because it's a principle called the PCEL Principle, after a famous Supreme Court case, that you don't change the rules of the game on the eve of the election. And that causes confusion for the election officials trying to administer the election. It causes confusion for voters. It breeds distrust in our whole system. So, the PCEL principle, it means that if you really want to change some significant aspect of the electoral set of rules in a particular state, you better do that, a year ago, not within a month of the election, because you're going to run into some, or at least up until this year, you would have been running into a bunch of skeptical judges. Of course, that's when we were suing. Now they're suing, and there's lots of exceptions, it turns out, to the PCEL principle, and it's okay to, suddenly purge non-citizens. So it's easy to be a little bit cynical about some of these supposed neutral principles.
Yeah, no, I can understand. It's really cool and fun when laws only apply to some people, which is great. Tell me more about this Washington Supreme Court case.
So we sued. So this is about signature matching. So in Washington is an all mail ballot state. So is Oregon. So is Colorado. And more and more people are voting by mail, which is why this is an important issue. When you vote your ballot by mail, you in almost every state, you sign the back of your ballot. And when you do that, you're signing a declaration under penalty of perjury that you're over the age of 18, you're an American citizen, you're entitled to cast this ballot, haven't been convicted of a felony, all that. When that ballot comes into the post office, into the elections office, they look at your signature and they compare it to, maybe it's your signature when you registered to vote, or maybe it's some other signature that they've captured from the Department of Licensing when your driver's license, or they collect a little library of signatures, and they look at the two of them, and they decide whether they think it matches or not. If they think it matches, then they put it in the pile to be counted, and everything's good. If they think it doesn't match, then they challenge the ballot and they put it in the don't count pile, and they're supposed to notify you of that it doesn't match, and then you have to go through a whole series of steps to get your ballot counted. Typically, that means signing a declaration or a form that says, that's really me. That's a really, really inaccurate process. Every election, and Washington is a pretty liberal state. Every election, and so is Colorado. Here in Colorado, we sued both states. There are something on the order of 50,000 ballots every election that are challenged that go through this process. And about half of them, or a little more than half of them, the voters succeed in convincing the election officials that that's really them and their ballot should be counted. But there's a whole chunk that don't. So in Washington, it's somewhere between 20 and 25,000 ballots don't get counted. Same number in Colorado. Now, the thing to remember is these are voters who did everything they were supposed to do. They registered to vote. They got their mail ballot. They looked at it. They conscientiously filled in all the bubbles. They put it inside the envelope. They signed the thing. They put it back in, and it got back to them on time. They did everything they were supposed to do. You can't criticize them at all. And then some clerk in some county looked at it and said, your signature doesn't match. So let's just stop the story there and think for a second. Why might your signature has changed? What did your signature look like when you were 18 and you registered to vote? Now think about your signature today. Did it change? And if so, why? Let's think about the person you mentioned a minute ago that had a stroke, or people that have Parkinson's or other degenerative diseases. They can't sign their ballot the same way twice. It's physically impossible. Or what about the people who voted by mail because they were leaving on a trip and they never got notice, or people serving in the military? We sued the state of Washington and the state of Colorado for this process because of the enormous impact. 25,000 voters being disenfranchised every election. And here's the big kicker. A disproportionate segment of those voters are young voters and minority voters. If you're a young Black voter in Washington state, your ballot is 17 times more likely to be challenged for signature mismatch than if you're a white voter over 40. That's outrageous. Now, I'm not saying that they do it intentionally because of race or age, But they have this process that we've created has that impact. And that's outrageous. And that's the point I was trying to make this morning in front of the Washington Supreme Court that, look, however, we can see the impact right here. 25,000 American citizens who did everything they should have done to get stripped of the right to vote, a disproportionate segment of them being young minority voters. Over here, what's the benefit? The state says this is critical to prevent voting fraud. Okay, so let's ask, how many cases of voting fraud have been caught by this signature verification process? We can stop and listen, and at least if you measure it by the number of people that have been charged with a crime, because it is a crime to falsely sign that declaration, or convicted, the answer is zero. Zero. This process has never caught someone cheating on a ballot that's resulted in either a prosecution or a conviction in the state of Washington. Yet so wildly ineffective at catching voter fraud, but really effective at disenfranchising a whole lot of people, and a lot of them young minority voters. And that, I think, is an unconstitutional restriction on the right to vote, which is the claim that we brought here in Washington State.
I would side with you. 100% convinced. Totally convinced.
Thank you, Your Honor.
So, Election day is very soon. These lawsuits are happening. It's a great time to be an election lawyer and a voting rights lawyer. A lot of work. What kind of impact is this going to be having on the outcome of the election, if you just had to guess?
Well, it can have a big impact. Let's just talk about the case I was just talking about, 25,000 votes. This is a state, in just this summer, we had the Commissioner of Public Lands race. It's a statewide office. The primary was decided by 49 votes. 49 votes. And we're talking about a pool that is rejected by the signature mismatch process of 25,000. So way, obviously enough to swing that election. In 2004, Washington State had a very close election for governor that was decided by 129 votes out of 2.8 million cast. 129. Minnesota's Senate election in 2008, I represented Al Franken. And that case was decided by a margin of 312 votes out of 2.9 million ballots cast. So it's not nothing. These little rules really can amount to a lot. So things like purging those so-called non-citizens in Virginia, that matters a lot. And then the reason that they're putting the money into this is they don't know, beforehand, we don't know which ones of these are going to be close. We don't know, it's probably not going to be Washington State. That's pretty reliably blue. Probably not going to be Texas. That's pretty reliably red. But in states like North Carolina or Virginia or Michigan or Wisconsin or Pennsylvania, those states where a few hundred votes one way or the other could tip the entire balance of the election. Florida in 2000, that was like 535 votes that decided the presidential election. So I think it can have a really, really big impact, but we won't really know that until after the fact.
Yeah. No, it's interesting because you mentioned, in 2020, I was like, which election? I was like, how long has Trump been on the scene? I was like, I've blocked a lot of it out.
Too long.
So agree. 2020, right? You mentioned that the GOP kind of being on the defensive, and trying to come through and find, voter fraud. And out of the 63 court cases, 62 said there's none. And the one case was kind of funky to begin with, that one. Now, NBC and a couple other places are reporting 130 cases, right? Brought on by the GOP to target, and in most cases, disenfranchise voters, or advocate for voting in ways that benefit them.
That's right.
It's a lot of money to put into this. And I know the Democratic Party has also like, created a team to fight against this. I mean, based on what you know, how many cases are like, I just don't know. I'm just spewing facts. I think I'm just like still overwhelmed with the amount of cases that are happening, the amount of time and energy and money it takes to be doing all of these, and the little success in showing any type of voter fraud, but the big success in showing voter disenfranchisement.
I think the boogeyman of voter fraud or non-citizen voting, which seems to be the theme of the day these days, is really just sort of a stalking horse to allow them to adopt rules that are more and more difficult to for people to vote. You would have thought that it's the one thing we can all agree on as Americans, that everyone should have the right to vote. My kids were little, and when Washington used to vote at polling places, I used to always bring them with me. I was sort of proud to like, this is how, our government runs. This is what we do. And now we don't vote in polls anymore. I'm not even sure it'd be safe to do that.
Yeah, it's scary.
So many the crazies out there.
I know.
But you would think that even the Republicans, like, well, yeah, like let's vote. You vote for your guy. We're going to vote for our candidate, and then let's go out for a beer. Like, and that's the way it should be. I always used to say, I actually can understand Republicans, that are committed. Like, they want the best thing for their country too. They just view it in a different way than I do. What I don't really understand is the people who say, "Oh, I don't get politics. I don't vote." Like, who are you? Like, well, those are the people I have a problem with. Not so much the people who are passionate about something else. Now, the world has sort of changed over the last 8 years due to the malignant influence of a certain presidential candidate that seems to have really distorted our national discourse and poisoned this into that somehow the Democrats are evil people. And, in fairness, there's people on our side too that really demonize
toxic dialogue. Totally.
Yeah, it really is. And that's unfortunate. I really hate to see that. But I think that this litigation, we're going to see a lot of it. It's going to be interesting to see what happens post-election, about, what lessons they have learned from the last time. Because the last time these lawsuits were wildly meritless. I mean, it was literally the legal equivalent of throwing spaghetti against the wall to see what sticks. And it was, and there was an interesting phenomena. The lawyers who were in the game before the election on the Republican side were, by and large, good lawyers, good law firms. And after the election, they sort of all stepped back, and a different set of, lawyers showed up on the scene, with, willing to make really pretty goofy arguments. And that's the reason that they lost. I mean, they had no evidence. They had, no real supporting law to challenge what they were doing. And they were just, filing anything, to try and get a sympathetic judge to issue some sort of order. And I think the most encouraging thing was that the judges who heard these cases across the board, whether it was a Trump judge or a Clinton judge or, a Democratic appointed judge, all of them, required those lawyers pursuing those lawsuits in the wake of 2020 to come forward with evidence. Like, don't give me your rhetoric. Don't sit down, counsel, call your first witness, introduce your first exhibit. But don't ask me to just overturn something because you come in here and start yelling and pounding on the podium and do a press conference out front. That's not how this works in this. And I find that, heartening that the judges came together to defend the Constitution. So how that plays out this time, I don't know. If I were a Republican lawyer, I'd be looking really hard at people like Rudy Giuliani and a whole bunch of other lawyers who were either stripped of their law license or, disbarred or sanctioned. And I think hard about those people's experience before I started signing some goofy complaints after this election. But
Are
we're going to
any of
see.
these current lawsuits setting it up to make it easier for Trump to try to contest the
For
2024
sure.
election? Yeah.
For 100%. That seems to be at least half of these lawsuits they filed, and then they're just sitting there. They haven't actually moved for an injunction. They haven't moved for any relief. They just filed this lawsuit and said the state failed its duty to do X, Y, Z, and then they're waiting. And I think they're waiting to see if Trump loses, how they'll revive the lawsuit and they say, see, we told you before, there's illegal voters voting, and now they did, and now we have a problem. And I think that we're going to probably see something like that. I mean, that would be my guess.
Disheartening. But also vote. Everyone needs to vote because people are working hard to take it away. And so if you have it, you need to use it. That's my PSA.
Well, that's the thing that I would emphasize. The lawyers can do whatever the lawyers can do, but we're just playing on the edges. The people who really have a voice here are the people who vote. So, the single most important thing you can do is to get out and actually vote. And, if you can do that in person, even better. And even if it, in the poor people in Atlanta typically have to stand in line for 2-3 hours sometimes to vote. And I would encourage every one of them to bring a lawn chair, do what you need to do, but stick it out. It's really important.
All right. And anything else we should keep in mind before the big day coming up?
I don't think so. Cross your fingers.
Yeah. Have a latte. I'm going to have more beer,
Have a latte. Have a beer.
Yeah.
That's right.
Kevin, thank you so much. I'm your host, Emily Gross. We'll be back next week with another episode of Beerocracy.